Welcome to Honest Money. I'm your host, Anja, and today's episode is brought to you by Hardblock. Hello. Joining me today is Seb Bunney, probably a man who doesn't need an introduction. And I have a little surprise for you, Seb. You're my 21st guest.
No way. That
Yes.
is awesome. That's really, really cool. Oh, man. 23. That's amazing. Or 21, sorry.
Yeah, 2021. Is it nighttime where you're currently at?
No, it looks dark, and it's simply just because we are in the depths of winter.
Oh.
Although if I turn my laptop, you can see out the window, it's raining outside right now, and it's about 2 or 3 degrees. It's, at the moment, I would say we've got the middle of winter vibes where you're kind of like settling down, you're spending time by the fire, and you're doing a lot of self-reflection on 2025. And I'm sure once spring has sprung, I will be up and about looking at the world from a different light. But at the moment, I've definitely been in the depths of just like looking inwards.
It looks very cozy. I am also based in the woods right now, but I'm in a tropical woods with like almost a jungle vibe. So kind of almost the polar opposite of you.
You know what? Like, I think that depending on wherever you are in the world, I find it so fascinating that we're all going through like different experiences. I'm from New Zealand, and when Christmas comes around, it's like, well, let's have a barbecue on the beach. And here, it's like when Christmas comes around, it's like, nope, you're in the depths of like 10 feet of snow, and it's very much like the middle of winter. And so it's interesting just to notice how we're showing up differently depending on where you are in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking about 2025, what have been some of your reflections about that?
I would say, you know what, like there's a book that I'm reading right now by a guy called J. Krishnamurti, and he's just a really profound individual and just shares just such a wealth of wisdom. One of the things he talks about is just the importance of being present, the importance of being able to notice that everything we experience is just information, and we're the ones that attach the labels of positive and negative to any such situation. And usually if we're feeling frustrated or we're feeling angry or we're feeling a lot of what are these deemed like heavier emotions, it tends to be because we're comparing what is happening right now to a state that we want to be in, or we're comparing what's happening right now to the past or the future. And that means that we're actually not being present. And so any situation, being able to recognize, hey, be grounded, it's just information, and just accept the situation for what it is. And what comes up is, as you said in the question you asked, is there's an old, I think it's like a Buddhist fable, and it talks about how there's this farmer, and this farmer wakes up one morning and he goes outside, and his horse has run away, and his next door neighbor is like, man, you have the worst luck. And he was like, oh, well, goes about his day, goes back to bed. The next day he wakes up and goes outside, and his horse has returned with 4 wild horses. And the farmer is just like, the next neighbor, sorry, is like, oh my God, you have the best luck. He was like, oh, well, goes about his day, goes back to bed, wakes up the next morning, and his son has gone outside to try and ride one of these wild horses and falls off and breaks his arm. And the next door neighbor is just like, man, you have the worst luck. And he was just like, well, goes about his day, goes back to bed, wakes up the next morning, and his nation has gone to war. And everyone has to enlist unless they're injured. And so his son didn't have to go to war. And so I think what it's really trying to highlight is how we go through life and we have all of these experiences. And sometimes we can get caught up labeling them as like, oh man, that's a negative experiences, that's a bad experience. But in reality, they're just situations, and they're situations that lead to the next situation and the next situation. And so I think our perspective is what's really important, and being able to look at everything from a positive perspective, what can I learn from this, I think is so important. There's my rant.
Yeah, absolutely. Love the rant. I love fables. I think there's just, again, it goes back to storytelling. It's just such a great way to kind of relay information onto other humans. And I remember growing up, my grandparents would tell me a lot of stories like this as I was a kid, and it's had a big influence in my life. So I do like it.
Well, and to be honest as well, like what I find really interesting, my own journey has been kind of diving into obviously Bitcoin, but also just like trauma and and childhood experience and culture. And what's really interesting when you start digging into childhood experiences, how do we pass down knowledge? How do we pass down culture? And there's certain kind of movements, let's take like the hippie movement, that has been around since the 60s, the 70s, and is only 2 generations old, and it's almost dead. And then you see other cultures like the Australian Aborigines that have been around for 100,000 years, and in many ways are continuing to pass down that culture. And so you ask, why? What is the difference between them and the hippie movement? And the difference is that the hippie movement is a peer-driven culture. The hippie movement is peers sharing information, which means the next generation isn't privy to that information, tends to die very quickly. Whereas I think that it's become sad that we've got this society that's so independent, we kind of live our own lives, that we don't hear these fables passed down by our grandparents. We don't hear these fables passed down by our ancestors that are able to share so much wisdom about how to show up in life. And I think when you look at a lot of these more indigenous populations, they live in multi-generational households. As a kid, you're experiencing multiple generations with very different insights and wisdom to pass down. And so I think that as I'm getting older, I'm recognizing the importance of just really expanding that friend network to people of all ages, being able to really spend time with grandparents, great-grandparents, because everyone has such a different perspective and can pass down wisdom. And I think it's how we build closeness and knowledge about the world as opposed to just being with our peers.
Yeah, I love what you said, and I kind of want to dive a little bit further into something I think you mentioned, and that is the theme around trauma and independence. You strike me as a very independent person. Do you think that has anything to do with your like upbringing?
Absolutely. Like 100%. And I think that trauma can go both ways. It can make you very anxious in, say, your attachments. It can make you hyper independent. I would say that, and I don't talk maybe too much about this on kind of like podcasts, but I like my mum was a single mum, and my dad didn't really want much to do with me when I was a kid. And what that meant is that I spent a lot of time with my mum, and my mum had a really traumatic upbringing in New Zealand. My grandparents were Australian. My granddad's Australian, grandma's a Kiwi, and my mum was kind of kicked out of the house at like 13 years old, and kind of had to fend for herself. And so when she had me, who was an accident, all of a sudden she was like, "Oh my God, I've got to take accountability in this life." And she just kind of fueled all of her energy into me. And I kind of ended up becoming her emotional support. And so what it's meant is that I think from my mum having to figure out life at such an early age, and then also putting on a lot of pressure on me to also meet her emotional needs, I've walked through this world with a need to support others, and I think an independence, but that's very much from my own upbringing, from my childhood. And then I see it the inverse with my brother. I've got two younger brothers. The youngest brother, I think by the time my mum had my youngest brother, who had this 5 years difference, my youngest brother kind of, my mum was so tired. She had kind of spent most of her life raising the three of us, and she didn't have as much energy to give to him. And because he didn't necessarily have his emotional needs met to the same extent, I think he's constantly looking for attachment. He's looking for attachment. And so what you see is me being the oldest, hyper independent, looking out for others, him being the youngest, needs connection, needs attachment, and is reliant on validation from others. And so you see the dynamic shift, even just being the youngest to the oldest, our relationship with others, our relationship with our parents, growing up at different times.
Yeah, you do give me the oldest child vibes as well.
There's definitely sibling placement is so fascinating. Like I can usually, when I meet someone, I've probably got an 80% win rate at guessing if they're the oldest child or not. Like you can usually tell either an oldest child or even an only child. Only children give off very unique vibes, I find.
Okay, do you want to guess me?
No, we're live right now. I do. You have siblings though, don't you?
Well, I did have a brother. He passed away nearly like 8 years ago now. So, yeah, kind of unexpected, very unexpected actually. So, yeah, that was very traumatic for my family. Yeah, yeah.
No,
But
oh, sorry, you go.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what is your first money memory? Like, do you have like the earliest memory about money as like a toddler or a child?
That's a really good question. I don't think I've ever been asked this question before.
Quick one for the Aussies listening. Hardblock is offering a $10 sign up discount right now. And if you're with another exchange, ask yourself this: are they Australia's longest running Bitcoin only exchange? Because if not, maybe it's time to switch. Head to hardblock.com.au/join/honest money and start stacking sats today.
Hmm. You know, I remember I remember growing up, like, and this is when, so I was born in the UK and raised in New Zealand. And we moved from New Zealand when I was about 5 years old. And I remember receiving pocket money and wanting to really count the coins. There was something so visceral about having tangible money. And I always used to also want to find money. So I used to then go and hide my pocket money around the house and in various board games and in various pockets to try and forget about it, to then go and find it later. But I would always remember where I hid it. So I was never able to trick myself into trying to find money. But I would say that, like, that was my first memory of money, as I remember feeling like there was an importance to money. I remember feeling as if this thing that I'm holding right now, there's an importance, there's a weight to it, not meaning physically, and more meaning like emotionally yeah. And I would say that what comes to mind again as you ask that question is there's a TED talk that I listened to around 8-9 years ago, and the TED talk was discussing this idea about how kids these days have lost touch with the importance of money. And one of the reasons is because money is no longer tangible, money is largely digital, it becomes so much easier to spend. We're not as attached to money as we have been in many ways. And I'm not necessarily talking in a negative way that we care about money, but more because of the tangible nature of it. You can feel it in your pocket. I think money to us carries more weight. And so what this guy ended up doing, this TED talk was about, was he took a game of Monopoly, he swapped out all of the money for real money, and then he noticed how the kids changed their tactics and changed how they played the game. And the moment he put real money in the game and he put a bit of a monetary reward for the winner of the game, all of a sudden, the kids were a lot more fiscally responsible. They started to show up more. They started to take accountability more. And so you see it in kids today where, because they just get given their parents' credit card, or in many times they don't even get given the credit card, they can just tap their phone. What they're being taught is that money is just ethereal thing, and you can walk through life and you can get what you want. And so I think that it's no wonder that a lot of these banks, they go and sell credit cards, these debt instruments, to these young kids, these teenagers, these high school students, these university students, and then they just find themselves in an immense amount of debt because it's so easy to spend money these days without an understanding of the importance or how hard it is to earn. So it's interesting. That was a bit of a random thread there, but I'm noticing that as we moved away from tangible money into the digital world, it also changed how we interact with money. And so I very much remember as a kid the importance of physical money and liking to count my money.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. I remember that as well. And I very early on remember feeling like I knew that money had value.
Mm-hmm.
It was like property that was different to other kinds of property. But how do you think, Bitcoin being digital, how do you think that's going to impact future generations and people being raised, like kids being raised and taught about Bitcoin very early on? Do you think they're going to not feel like it's real?
So it's a really interesting point, because I think that this whole topic that we've just been discussing is, as money's gone digital, we have almost become more and more disconnected from money. But I think that it's multifactorial. There's another factor in that, and that is that as money has lost value, we have our time preference. So for those that aren't familiar, you've got the spectrum of preference. You've got a high time preference on one side, which is you want to meet your immediate needs. You want to kind of be impulsive. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got a low time preference. And that is, you're thinking about the future. You're thinking about prosperity. How do I show up and be the best version of myself? And so I think that as money is broken down, as we've faced inflation, as our purchasing power doesn't go as far, it's shifted us from this lower time preference, thinking about the future, to this higher time preference. Oh my God, I don't know what my money's going to be worth tomorrow. This is all unconscious, so I'm going to spend it now. And so I think that we have become hyper fixated on money, earning money, because we don't know where it's going to come from. We don't know how we're going to put food on the table. We don't know how we're going to support our families. And what I've found really interesting about Bitcoin is, even though it is digital, because when you look at your wallet, you're starting to see your purchasing power increase over the long term, you start to think very differently. It starts impacting you on a psychological level. If all of a sudden you think, okay, you know what, based on my income, I think it's going to take me 10, 15 years to save for a down payment for a house. And then with Bitcoin, 5 years in, you're like, oh my God, I may be able to save for a house within the next couple years. All of a sudden, it's made the future, you've brought it forward, and you're able to start dreaming again. You're able to start having hope for the future. And so I think Bitcoin is shifting our behavior, even though it is digital, it's shifting it towards saving, less consumption, and thinking about prosperity and how do I show up and be the best version of myself. And so I kind of tend to say, like, the irony of Bitcoin being money is that it actually gets us to stop thinking about money and starts getting us to think about what is actually most important to me. How do I actually want to show up? What is it that I really value? And so that I find is so fascinating. Like, even on my own personal journey, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Bitcoin has made me reflect so much more on what is actually important to me, and recognizing that what is important to me is not these external things, having the nice watch, having the nice car, having the nice this or that. It's actually, hey, I really want to contribute and create value for society, and I really want to be able to support those that I care about. And I really want to be able to build a family because I want to see the human race thrive, and I think we need to have kids. And so anyway, I think that Bitcoin is changing how we're showing up, and it's allowing us to think bigger, and it's allowing us to think about the future, and it's actually getting us to stop thinking about money. Whereas when money is broken, it's getting us to constantly hyperfixate on money and where is money going to come from and how do I make more money and such.
Absolutely. I really relate to that. And going back to my brother, like, I noticed there's two things in my whole life that kind of made me think about legacy. Like, what is the legacy that I want to impart on this world? And one is losing my brother and thinking about his life and how much of an impact he had on the people around him in the short time that he was with us. And the second is Bitcoin. So, it's really, really made me think about, again, that longer term time horizon, and really helping Australian families understand it, helping de-weird Bitcoin in Australia, because it still carries a certain stigma. And I like to get into this as well. Sometimes I just ask ChatGPT conversations like, why does Bitcoin break people's brains? And one of the things that came up from like a psychological perspective that I thought was really interesting, it said something along the lines of, people feel that it's unfair because it breaks down the hierarchy that everybody's used to having and understanding. So in a system where you need to work hard in order to make a living, and you need to translate your capital, your I guess your income into some other forms of capital by creating something or by investing, that framework makes sense to people. But then having something just go up in value because of its scarcity and because of its attributes, it almost feels like unfair.
Mhm.
So what do you think of that?
I think it's absolutely spot on. I would word it slightly differently. The way that I interpret it is that, like, we all hold beliefs about the world, how we think the world works. And these beliefs, the way that I kind of tend to think about them is maps. They're basically certain maps that allow us to navigate this experience that we call life. And we have maps about relationships. We have maps about food and what we should be eating, what we shouldn't be eating. We have maps about money. We have maps about the sciences, biology, psychology, and such. And what I find really fascinating is that these maps aren't the territory. they are a representation of the territory. So we're constantly updating these maps. And I think that why Bitcoin is so threatening in many ways is because it breaks down some of our maps about how we think the world works. And one of those is obviously the map of money. I think we move through this world for most people when we think, well, prices naturally go up over time. And in order to be able to have a stable currency, we need to have a central bank, a central issuer, and deflation, so prices falling, is destabilizing. And so that is the map that is money. With Bitcoin, to be able to understand Bitcoin, what you actually have to do is to tear up that map and recognize, actually, if you want to have a stable currency, you need to remove a centralized issuer. And actually, because technology is driving down prices, we should see prices falling over the long term, not prices rising. And so all of a sudden, that like breaks people's minds. And so rather than redrawing that map, which would obviously trigger redrawing many other maps about how do governments work, maybe how does money impact us as individuals, and people would rather just stick with the map that they know, because it's very energy consumptious having to refigure out how the world works. And I think that as human beings, since the dawn of time, we're always trying to be efficient. We're trying to minimize energy expenditure. And so if all of a sudden we're having to redraw these maps and try and refigure out how the world works, especially if we're boomers and would have spent 65, 70 years on this planet, that is very destabilizing. And so I think that is, in my mind, that's why Bitcoin is so threatening, is because it's getting us to constantly redraw these maps. But what I've also found really fascinating on the flip side is that when you go and interact with Bitcoiners, because they've already redrawn this map that is money, they usually have also been curious about, what other maps am I using to navigate this world that may not be accurate? And so all of a sudden, they're redrawing the maps that is healthcare. They're redrawing the maps that is pharmaceuticals. They're redrawing the maps which is education. They're redrawing the maps which is global politics. And so I find it so fascinating that once you actually go on this journey of kind of being a cartographer, going and redrawing all of these maps, suddenly you start realizing, I've been using all these maps that are not really representing reality that accurately. And that's what I find so fascinating about Bitcoin.
Yeah, I love that. And it reminds me of one of my favorite sayings, which is, let me just try to remember it now. And there's a few different ones, but like the root of our suffering. Have you heard of those sayings? There's a few different variations, but the one that kind of seems to land the most with me is like the root of our suffering is the lies we tell ourselves.
Totally.
That's the one that lands.
Yeah, I think that it's almost like there's a quote at the start. I think it's from Mark Twain. Don't quote me on this. It's at the start of The Big Short. And so if most people have watched The Big Short about the housing the collapse in 2008. And it says, it's not what we don't know that gets us in trouble. It's what we know that just ain't so. And so it's just like, to me, I find this so important. It's just like we tend to be looking out there for all of these things that we don't know about, which is what gets us in trouble. But actually, instead, it's what we think about the world. It's how we think the world works, only to realize that's not how the world works, that actually gets us in trouble. And so it's the same idea. We're moving through this world using certain maps, such as, hey, you know what? Animal fats are bad. I shouldn't be eating animal fats. You know what? I should just be eating grain and soy products and seed oils. And then all of a sudden it's like, these things they're not making me feel good. And maybe the research around these things, there's certain incentives to push a certain agenda that isn't necessarily good for health. So you go and redraw the map and you're like, whoa, it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know. It's what you know that just ain't so. You redraw the map and suddenly life is very different. You feel so much better. And so I think that what I always just am constantly trying to do as an individual is to constantly redraw the maps. What maps am I using that aren't servicing me?
Yeah. And I love that analogy. It really, really lands. I wanted to talk to you about, like, we talk a lot as Bitcoiners about like all the downstream effects of money. And we kind of tend to cover some of the more common ones like cost of living and the wealth disparity and things like that. But I wanted to know, and not many people have spoken about this, but I think it's important. Do you think money has an impact on dating culture?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Okay, let's go. Let's go.
Where do I start? So I would say that, okay, actually a perfect example. So where I live in a small town called Squamish. I just moved here about a year ago, 30 minutes south of a ski town called Whistler. Whistler's one of the biggest ski resorts in the world. People from all over the world come to Whistler. What I've noticed in Whistler, very early on is that because there's so much demand to be in this place, so many people are fighting for rental properties. As a result, rental prices skyrocket. What that means is that as a single individual, it is so costly to live in Whistler. And so I've seen it time and time and time again where people are pushed into relationships because they're just like, you know what? If we actually go and rent a place together right now, then we're going to basically half our expenditure. So life becomes a lot easier as a couple. As a result of broken money, people are being pushed into relationships, rushing into relationships where their needs aren't necessarily being met. And this is obviously, we're seeing this in small towns like Whistler, where you're seeing really high demand, but it's not unique to Whistler. We're now seeing it the world over. I think that when we're facing massive inflation globally, when the cost of living is rising, when house prices are skyrocketing, where rent is skyrocketing, food prices are skyrocketing, it's a lot cheaper to be a couple than it is to be a single individual. And I think that people are, again, they're rushing into relationships without that self-reflection. And what are we seeing right now? We're seeing the highest rates of divorce. People are no longer getting married at the same rate. Maybe that's because we're also seeing a degradation of people kind of leaning into religion. But I think there's a lot of negative effects of rushing into relationships before people really know themselves, before they really know each other. And I've just seen on a deeper level just the rising rates of depression, the rising rates of anxiety, the rising rates of substance abuse. And I think that money has such a huge role to play in this. And people, if they're not having their needs met in their relationship, but they can't afford to be single, then people stay in things that aren't necessarily servicing them. And so I've just seen this time and time again. And I'm sure, of course, I think there's many other aspects that we can talk about, but I think that's a big one that kind of comes to mind initially.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to, it reminds me of that typical high time preference dating. When you watch some old movies, like black and white movies, you think about there's like a process of courting, and that just doesn't happen.
Totally. I think that, and this isn't even necessarily a monetary thing, but I think that what technology is also doing, and I've noticed this, I've spent time on dating apps, is that when you're on a dating app, you're picking someone really superficially. You don't know this person. You're seeing some pictures of them, you're seeing maybe a tiny bit of information, and you're choosing whether or not to swipe left or swipe right. And by the time you go and meet up with someone who you have matched with, you know what their agenda is. They know what your agenda is. It's that, hey, we want to potentially make a relationship of this if we enjoy each other's company. And so what that has meant is that after, say, the first date of meeting someone, you've got to choose, hey, am I really interested in this person? Am I not interested in this person? And so you almost go through this rejection point where you have to reject someone, but you don't even know the person. And so I think people are finding themselves in relationships that they're really not listening to their intuition. Their intuition is maybe telling them no, but they feel guilty about rejecting someone and saying, hey, I don't feel it in this relationship. So people are finding themselves in relationships that they would never have got into if they'd just met this person on the street. And the difference is from even 10, 15 years ago is that everybody met in either in a bar, through friend networks, in the natural environment. And it meant that when you interact with someone, they don't have to know that you're thinking about, am I interested in this person? And then after you've spent a little bit of time with someone, then you can say, hey, do you want to go and grab a drink? Or hey, do you want to go on a date? And so you're able to determine where you sit and listen to your body without having to go through that rejection phase. So I find it really interesting how technology is changing how we're showing up from a relationship standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing as well, like, going back to the 60s and the 70s, you could easily afford one, family home on a single salary. And that meant that, women could focus on staying at home and being stay-at-home mums and homemakers. And that's just no longer a reality. And I think a lot of women feel really guilty about that because you're kind of having to choose between your natural desires and what's kind of being forced upon you top down in a sense. So yeah, it's weird.
Totally. And I think on like building on that idea, most people have obviously, they're familiar with like the feminist movement, and I hope this isn't too controversial here.
No,
but
this
I
is
think
a Bitcoin podcast.
I think that what what I've noticed when you really dig into the history of the feminist movement is that the feminist movement emerged out of the fact that the US government realized that only 50% of the population were paying taxes. It was predominantly the males. So how do we increase tax revenue? Well, let's just push it that no, we need equality. We need like more women in the workforce. Now, I'm all for women being able to drop in to their masculine and be like, hey, I want to be a manager of this company. I want to start my own startup. I want to do all of this. I'm all for that. I think it's absolutely amazing. But women shouldn't necessarily have pressure to go and do that. And I think that what it's done, the feminist movement in many ways, is there's a lot of women that are getting these motherly instincts coming in and they're feeling like, hey, I want to have a kid. Hey, I want to show up in different ways. And they've had to suppress that because they felt judged from society. And so where I live in the Cedar Sky, I've had many friends that are women that when they've reached their 30s, their late 30s, and they start to reflect about who they are and what they realize is, actually, I do want kids and I do want to start a family, but it's now almost too late because I thought I had to go out and do all of these masculine academic things and go and get the big job, the high paying job, be in the corporate world. And I'm actually recognizing that that's what society is pushing me to do, but that's not what I want to do. And so I find it really interesting. The pendulum, I feel like, is starting to swing back a little bit, where we're finding this balance where women are able to lean into what they feel they need and what is important to them, while also still being able to branch out and be more professional if they want to do that. Go seek the startup, the management job. But if they're not feeling that, they shouldn't feel shame in that. And they shouldn't feel shame in wanting to have kids or listen to that motherly instinct and such.
Yeah. And the other thing as well is what I love about Bitcoin is that, there's many fathers that I know here in Australia that absolutely do get more time with their kids as well. And that's the profound shift that it's made for them as well. Like, it's so nice to have not one, but two parents at home spending more time and being present. So, yeah.
Oh, couldn't agree more. And I feel really lucky that I've spent a lot of time around kids. I've done a lot of coaching around kids. I've ran kids programs. And I just think there's something so rewarding about passing knowledge on to the next generation, being around young ones. And so it's just like, I cannot wait to have kids and to be able to like share that knowledge and to interact with them in that level. And although I still want to have things on the side, I want to have little businesses and startups. I want to be able to like introduce kids to that at such a young age. And I think that that's just what's missing in society, is that most parents, both parents, are going out, they're having to work, the kids are just going into daycare, the kids are not getting their attachment needs met, the parents are going out and they're forced to work, they're not able to interact with the kids to the same level, they're not feeling fulfilled from a workplace standpoint. And so I feel like broken money is really sapping our ability to show up authentically.
This is why Bitcoin is great.
Totally.
But I saw you recently tweeted about an elaborate scam. And this is something as well that I'm really passionate about, especially because Australia in particular is really vulnerable to being, it's like a target country for a lot of scammers overseas. We've got money. We're also very trusting as a nation. We're used to having, third parties babysit our money for us. Yeah, so it's. I want to talk about this. What happened?
So, oh man, it's the complexity of these scams these days. I'm blown away with. And essentially, this guy reached out, and he was just like, "Hey Seb, I work for Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank, we want to kind of really direct energy towards the Web3 crypto Bitcoin space, and I'm wondering if you wanted to come on and do a podcast, Bitcoin versus crypto." And so I was just like, I'm all for defending Bitcoin and the whole Bitcoin versus crypto conversation. So I was just like, I'll absolutely jump on. And so he ended up adding me to a Telegram group. Now, this Telegram group, it turns out, was more of a discussion around how Deutsche Bank want to create a whole Bitcoin academy. And they ended up having, supposedly, the CISO, which, if I remember correctly, was saying like the Chief Innovative Solutions Officer or something of, if I remember correctly, it was PayPal. And then they also had the Chief Product Strategy Officer of Coinbase and Visa. And so I was like, whoa, these are such like heavy hitting individuals. I feel really honored to be in this room, but I was like, why am I in this room with these like really, really heavy hitting individuals? And I'm just like Seb Bunney who wrote a book. And so I'm looking at this, and that was the first red flag. The first red flag was, why have I all of a sudden been put in this Telegram group? So in hindsight, what that was kind of like social proof. It's trying to make it look like, because there are some really heavy hitting individuals in here, there's authenticity to this. So I just assumed they were the legitimate people. Obviously, it turns out later that they were not the legitimate people. So we started having this kind of conversation back and forth. And then all of a sudden, the podcast shifted. It shifted from Bitcoin versus crypto to, Seb, can you talk about your experience in startups? And I was like, that's not really my area of expertise, but for sure, I can talk about my experience in startups. I've been involved in a few different startups. And they sent over kind of 21 questions around Bitcoin startups and what's it like in Bitcoin startup culture. So I spent a few days, like 3 or 4 days, really thinking about these questions, really jotting down my thoughts, putting together so that I could at least try and give the best answers to these questions. And then on the day of the podcast, I jump on the call with this guy. And this guy, he doesn't have his camera on. He's got a picture up. And immediately he's like, so if this podcast goes well, Seb, we'd love to offer you a job at Deutsche Bank. And I'm standing there, I'm like, what? I'm so confused. Like, we're doing a podcast. And I'm sure Deutsche Bank, they're one of the, I don't know, the top 5 banks, I assume, globally. Like, there's no way they're just going to be like hiring people willy-nilly just because you're on a podcast with them. So I felt I would say my spidey senses were really starting to tingle at this point. Because I was just like, I've noticed I'm in a Telegram group with all of these high-flying individuals. I'm now on a podcast with this guy, but he's not even talking about the podcast. He's trying to potentially offer me a job from Deutsche Bank. And then he says, okay, I'd like to move over to the podcast recording software. Can you go to this website? And it was called, I think it was called Jandi, Jandi. And he was like, oh, it's a Chinese podcast recording software like Riverside, and you just need to sign up. And so I was like, okay, I'll jump onto there. And he was like, yeah, I'm in Hong Kong, so this is the one that we use. I'm in Deutsche Bank Hong Kong. So I was like, okay, this kind of semi makes sense. And so I go to sign up, and it says like technical error. And so I let him know. I'm just like, hey, there's this kind of technical error going on right now. And he was like, oh, I'll just speak to the technical team. And he spends a few minutes away, and then he comes back and he was just like, oh, we don't know what the technical error is. You can just use the last person who we recorded a podcast with. I'll just give you his credentials. So they gave me just a random person's email and password. And immediately I was like, I'm 99% sure this is a scam now. And there was a part of me that was like, I'm just going to continue on a little bit further to understand like what it is that they're doing. And so I logged in, and then it says, okay, you need to download the software. And when you go and check the software, it's just like, oh, it needs access to all your files. It needs access to all of your calendar. It needs access to all your notes. And I just said to him, I was just like, hey, buddy, I think this software seems I'm not going to install this software. And he was like, let me see if there's another option, and I'll go speak to the technical team. And I was like, okay. And he went away to the technical team, and I looked on his Twitter account from the guy that had messaged me, and it said, hey, I've been working in for Deutsche Bank for 4 years. Well, when I'd asked him at the very start of the recording, so how long have you been working at Deutsche Bank? He was like, I've been working there for like 3 or 4 months. And so I'm like, things are really starting to not add up. And all of a sudden, I reckon he knew that I was onto him. I wasn't going to install the software. I started to ask kind of more questions, and then the Zoom call just dropped. It dropped, and then I went on to the chat on Twitter, and his chat had been deleted. I go onto his page, and I start scrolling down the page, and after about 20, 30 posts, it's a completely different person. It's in Mandarin or some other Asian language. And so you can see that what happens is they buy some random Twitter account. They give a persona. Hey, I work for Deutsche Bank. I do this, this, and this. They post a few posts because most people are not going to scroll down their page. So it gives credibility. And I think the thing that kind of like confused me is that he was followed by 10 to 20 other Bitcoiners that I know that work in the Bitcoin space. So I was like, well, there must be validity here. But now what I'm recognizing is that he usually probably goes and follows these individuals. He's doing the same thing to them. And so ultimately, this was just some elaborate way to get access to your laptop, to be able to then probably go scan your laptop, see if they can find 12, 24 word seed phrase, and then just go and drain your Bitcoin wallet. And they realized very quickly that after I'd been on the call, I wasn't really complying. I wasn't downloading the software. I wasn't allowing them access to my files. But to me, it just blows me away. Like, these people spent 2 weeks building this relationship with me and kind of leading me on. And I would say I'm relatively tech savvy, and I'm able to recognize when I'm being played. And although there was a lot of red flags, it wasn't until the actual day of the call that I realized that this was a scam. And so I think about the boomer generation. I think about individuals that aren't as tech savvy, and I can see they would so easily just install software and just click yes, yes, approve, like all permissions, so it can go and access all your files. And then if they had any sensitive information, that sensitive information is gone. Immediately they've lost their Bitcoin. Immediately they've lost access to their email accounts and whatnot. So it makes me feel very sad that the world we live in is such a it's lost that trustworthiness. We can't just trust people. And I'm glad I managed to catch it. I'm glad nothing happened. But I'm finishing up just a little article explaining what happened in a little more detail and the steps, so that people can hopefully catch on if it's happening to them.
Yeah. And where's that article going to be available, on X or Substack?
Yeah, I'll post it on X.
Okay.
I'll most likely post it on X, or I'll probably post it on my own website, sebbunny.com.
Need a way to sign, verify and secure your Bitcoin? Australia's one-stop shop for Bitcoiners has you covered. From signing devices, nodes and backup solutions to Bitaxes, Daycall and apparel. Visit shopbitcoin.com.au.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, that is just really scary. But then I thought, as a kid who used to squirrel money away, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't leave any seed phrases on your laptop.
I only use hot wallets on my laptop, and I keep all my seed phrases in just a sticky note on my laptop screen.
Love it. I wanted to talk a little bit more about your book as well. I haven't read it yet. It's on my list. But how has it been received so far?
Honestly, I'm just blown away with, one, this community, and two, how should I say this? I never, and this may sound a little odd, I never expected that I'd ever write a book. Like, I dropped out of school when I was like 13, 14 years old, and I dropped out of English when I was 12 years old, and English was never my thing. And I think it wasn't my thing because I never really found my way of expressing myself through language, through the written language. I found myself expressing myself in the form of sports. And so I spent my life in the mountains, mountain biking. So when the pandemic hit, I'd had all of these years of accumulation of being curious about the financial markets and macroeconomics, but I'd never really shared any of this information. And so I started writing at the start of the pandemic, and people just seemed to resonate with these ideas about how does money impact us as individuals? How does it impact the family unit? And really speaking to the layperson. And so I kind of fell into this world of writing. It didn't come from a place of practice. It came from a place of simply wanting to get out what I'm noticing and what I'm feeling, and what I am kind of connecting the dots between these various disparate ideas, whether it's macroeconomics or psychology, trauma, money and such. And I never in a million years expected it to do what it did. I never expected it to be like a #1 bestseller globally on kind of across all of its topic platforms on Amazon and such. And so it's just been such an incredible journey. And yeah, overall, I just feel really, really grateful. I feel really grateful to have this opportunity to be able to jump on these podcasts, share my perspective, meet really fascinating individuals, and have conversations about these topics.
Yeah, I love your writing style. This is the beautiful thing about books. Every book that I've read, I feel like I get to really know the soul of the person writing it. And yeah, it's very kind. There's a lot of kindness in the way that you relay this information, and you don't make the reader feel stupid for not knowing something. I feel like that really stands out in your writing style. But what would you say, like, which part of the book creates like the most impact, do you think?
That's a really good question. And again, I haven't been you're asking questions that I haven't heard before. And so it's interesting. It makes my mind go into different places. I would say that there's like a core thread throughout the book. And the core thread throughout the book is that everything is downstream of money. And I think that a lot of individuals, when we speak to them, when you speak to your parents, when you speak to your friends, when you speak to your work colleagues, people never really stop and ask, what is this thing called money? And how is money actually impacting me as an individual and how I show up? And so what I really wanted to try and articulate in the book is just how impactful money is, whether that is on a psychological level and us showing up, whether it's on a familial level and how we kind of raise kids and our relationship with our partner, whether it's on a consumerist level, on a political level, an environmental level. I think that money really is at the root of a lot of the challenges which we're facing. And I think a lot of us don't necessarily quite grok or grasp just how important money is. So I'm sure, like, even on your own experience, your perception of money has probably shifted from getting into Bitcoin from what it was when you're a kid, even through most of your adult life.
It absolutely has. And my first memory of money was money being used as a store of value. So that's kind of what I thought as a child. I used to think, when I first came across physical money, I thought this is something precious that needs to be saved, that needs to be kept for future use. It's not a property that you just kind of dispose of. And then growing up and going through my entire work life and as an adult, realizing that you kind of have to invest to hold on to your money because of inflation. And then Bitcoin comes in and kind of restores what I feel like my first impression of money was, that it should be a store of value.
Wow, that is so cool. And I just find it's so fascinating because I think at its core, we have this desire from such a young age to think about the future, think about what is possible, and hopefully save to build that future. And it makes me feel sad when I think about what's been stripped from society, which is where when money no longer holds value, people stop thinking about those things and they start to just exist in the moment. And although I obviously very much support the spiritual side of things when it comes to like being present, when I say exist in the moment, what I'm more meaning is that people are struggling so much that all they're doing is thinking about, oh my God, I need to meet these needs now, and they're not thinking about the future. There's a book that I recently read called The History of the American People, and it discusses the Mayflower, the first people that came from the UK, landed in America, and then each chapter is basically, if I remember correctly, it's about a 20, 30-year period, and then it goes all the way to present day. So what is it, from around the 16th century all the way up to present day? And one of the things it talks about is how during like the frontier period, when obviously the Brits came over to the US, and then you kind of had these generations that were kind of at the front, mind block on the term. You had these kind of like these individuals that really they were exploring this newfound land. They were showing up, exploring this newfound land and figuring out, okay, how do we thrive? And one of the things it mentions in a chapter is that a week's worth of work would buy you an acre. And so in a whole year, you could have 50 to 80 acres of the best land that you're then able to build a house on. You're able to grow your own food. And now to be able to own a house is a privilege. Most of my friends don't own houses. And if they do own something, they own an apartment and they feel like, oh my God, I'm so privileged to own this apartment. When in reality, up until about 150 years ago, everybody owned a house. Everyone had a house. Everyone was able to show up.
Big house too.
And a big house, 100%. And so it's just, I find it really interesting that today people can't really think about the future because it's just completely out of touch.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot. I noticed that our standards as a society have just dropped so low that you kind of have to feel like you're lucky if you own a tiny little house, and you're lucky if you get, $600,000 worth of savings for your superannuation. We have that system in Australia, which the industry says it's kind of the amount that you need to retire on, but in reality, you can't retire on that much unless you're planning to die very soon. And it's just, it's interesting the way that things are being pushed down upon us to kind of make us satisfied with less and feel grateful for having less. And I wanted to also touch on something. I want to know what you think about sometimes, like when it comes to saving money, some economists will use terms like hoarding. And it's a very inflammatory term for something that I feel like is human nature. It's very natural to save money for the future. And yeah, I feel like the term hoarding also kind of comes up in Bitcoin a bit as well. So what do you think is the psychology of that?
I'm going to try and connect two dots that I may do poorly, but we'll see if we can connect them. I read a tweet the other day, and I'll tie it back to hoarding in a second, that looked at how innovation tends to, or it is a innovation in the higher latitudes and the lower latitudes, so not around the equatorial nations, but more in kind of the north or the south, in the colder climates, tends to be far greater than innovation around the equatorial nations. And I thought this was really interesting because what it discussed is that in colder climates, you have to plan for the future. You have to think about, okay, we're about to go into 6 months of winter here. If I don't have food reserves, I'm going to die. And in the equatorial nations, that's not true. There's growing year round. You tend to have access to fruit and vegetables. And so there's no need to think about the future. And so I think that when we think about hoarding, there's this negative association, as you're mentioning, where a lot of economists say, no, if we have a deflationary currency, what that means is prices will be falling, which means our purchasing power increases over time, which is going to incentivize us to hoard as opposed to spend. And that could be hugely destabilizing. Now, I agree that it is destabilizing, but it is only destabilizing when we're in a heavily indebted nation. Because if all of a sudden these big corporations who they're reliant on income, this all of a sudden people stop spending to the same extent that they were, and less income is coming in for these various corporations, then those corporations are going to go under. And so, yes, it's hugely destabilizing because we could see a massive swath of defaults, this wave of defaults washing through society. But the positive side effect of that is that it would wipe clean a lot of the fiscal irresponsibility and a lot of the corporations that have borrowed beyond their means and are no longer able to service their debt service payments. So I think that in a world that were to actually align with reality, as Jeff Booth talks about, prices should be falling because naturally as individuals, we want to innovate. We want to be able to increase efficiency and productivity. We want to be able to get more for less through technology and our various services. And so the analogy I always like to give is like Netflix versus Blockbuster. Like you used to have to go drive down to Blockbuster, spend 30 minutes in Blockbuster figuring out what you want to watch. You used to have to drive home. You'd watch the movie. You'd drive back to Blockbuster, drop the movie off. Oh, it's scratched. So you had to go and pay a fine because you scratched the CD. And then you had to drive all the way back home again. And you think about all of the time, the energy, the gas expense, the cost of the DVD to go and rent that thing. And now for the pretty much the same price, you can get millions of movies at your fingertips through Netflix. And so technology should be driving down prices and life should be getting easier, but we're just not benefiting from that experience. And so ultimately, I think the natural state of things is deflation, prices falling. That is not bad. The problem is it is bad in an indebted nation. That's I think the differentiation.
I also want to ask you about like during the pandemic, a lot of things shifted culturally, especially like in the corporate world. And you can really see themes coming up about like quiet quitting and the productivity slowing down. And I think a lot of that is tied to potentially people seeing that, you know, hard work no longer pays off. I don't know what it is like in Canada, but in Australia, even, you know, if you're a high income earner, you're having some mortgage stress, you're having some financial stress. You pretty much can't live within any of the major cities around Australia unless you're earning over $100,000 as a single income. And yeah, I wonder if do you think that's also tied to the money printer where people are just kind of like giving up? Like they know something is inherently wrong. They can't necessarily put their finger on it.
Absolutely. And I think that it also goes back to the maps we were discussing earlier. Whereas I think the millennial generation has been kind of sold this map, which is if you go to higher education and you go and get qualified, then you're going to be able to leave higher education. You're going to be able to get a well-paying job. And through that well-paying job, you're going to be able to buy a house. And when you buy a house, you can kind of raise a family. And what instead people have been kind of receiving is they're going through higher education. And it's something like 1/3 of the population is going through higher education. They're coming out, that qualification, there's almost no jobs. It's like a desolate landscape. And then even if they are getting a job, there's so much competition for these jobs that most people are going through 10, 15, 20 different applications, getting rejected on most of them. I think a lot of people have been sold, especially the millennials and the younger generations, they've been sold this idea that, hey, if I go to higher education, I get a degree, I'm going to be able to come out, I'm going to be able to earn a decent income, I'm going to be able to buy a house and raise a family. And they're realizing that that's not the case. It's anywhere close to what their parents were able to do. And so I think that money is at the root of that, because the cost of living crisis that we're facing, the average house in North America in the 70s was 3 times the average person's wage. And now the average house is 9 times the average person's wage. And in areas of high demand, I don't know what it is in Byron, but I'm sure I can guess it's probably pretty similar to where I live. And in Squamish, here where I live, the average income is, I believe, $45,000 a year. And the average house is $1.6 to $2 million. And so when you start looking at this, you're just like, how? That's 15 to 20 times the average person's wage. You're just like, How is anyone going to be able to afford these houses? And what it means is that we have this society that is disconnecting. You're having this generation that's just like, I'm not able to afford a house. I'm not able to get ahead. And so why am I doing this job? This job isn't serving me. And so I think a lot of people are, in many ways, we're having this disconnect where people are hyperfixated on the present because they're simply trying to survive. And in other ways, they're just like, what's the point? What is the point? And they're kind of like giving up almost. And so I think that this quiet quitting is definitely a reflection of broken money, because people are tired of giving and giving and giving and giving and not being able to afford a lifestyle that's anywhere close to what their parents were able to afford.
Yeah. I have some girlfriends as well who are going through a bit of a tough financial phase because, and it's interesting because going back a few years ago, they said they were very good with money. They felt like they were good at saving, they were good at investing, and now they're just falling behind. And as a result, their behavior has changed. They actually tend to spend more and shop more because they're trying to make themselves feel better about a dire situation that they're in. So, and they're kind of aware of it as well. But I just feel like I can't do anything about it in a sense. Like they feel defeated, and it's heartbreaking.
It's devastating. And I used to work for this company, as a retail company, which sell outdoor clothing. And one of my colleagues, I remember he came in one day and he was just like, you know what? I'm done. I can't be bothered to try and save for a house. I'm never going to be able to afford a house. If I've got to save $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 to be able to go and put a down payment, 15, 20% down on a house, how am I ever going to be able to save that when I'm earning $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year? It's just not possible. And what I noticed is that his mentality shifted to more of this like superficial, he may look happy. He was going out partying more. He was going out and maybe spending more money on things that he wouldn't have done previously because he was trying to think about the future. And so on the face of it, on social media, life looks amazing. He's doing all of these cool things. But actually, when you go and speak to him, he was like super depressed. And I think that this is kind of the face of it with a lot of people. And I think social media doesn't help in that we tend to think that everyone else has got it all figured out because we're seeing these pictures that, oh my God, life is amazing. You're traveling the world, you're doing this, you're doing that. But I think a lot of people are worried that, yes, they're traveling the world right now, but they're in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, and they have no savings or no security for what the future may look like. And I think that scares a lot of people.
So do you think, if you're a young person listening, is Bitcoin really the best solution? Or are there other things?
I believe so. And without getting like too negative there, I think that ultimately, when I found Bitcoin, and most people, what do they say? They say you come for the gains and you stay for the revolution. I came into Bitcoin because I was like, man, I need an asset that's going to help kind of float my portfolio, push up my portfolio a little bit, make life a little easier. And I think a lot of us, when we're honest with ourselves, Bitcoin was a bit of like a lottery ticket. We didn't quite understand it when we first started saving and investing in it. And so we were just like, oh man, this thing's done wild in the past. Maybe it can do it again. But then when you start getting into Bitcoin, you start recognizing just how broken the monetary system is and how Bitcoin, I truly believe, is the best form of money we have. And so in the end, it's not about Bitcoin constantly pushing up your savings potential. What I think it is about is that how do we just create a system where it's rules instead of rulers? How do we create a system where we're all playing on an equal playing field? And as society thrives, as people innovate, as we increase productivity and efficiency, prices come down over time. And I think that's what it really, really is about. And I think Bitcoin, to me, is currently the best chance we have at creating a system where, as a society, we can thrive more. And it gets us to reflect a little more. It gets us to think about the future. It gets us to think about building a world where we are more collaborative and connected. Because at the moment, when money is breaking down, we're becoming more and more disconnected and hyper-fixated on survival.
And second last question, do you think there are ways for Bitcoin to fail?
I think that there's no certainty in anything. And so being able to acknowledge that, asking the question, like, how could Bitcoin fail? I would think that there's a couple potential different ways. I think one of them is, as humans, we struggle to think about the second, third, fourth order effects of our actions. And so I think that we may have developers that go and push certain changes to the code, and we can't comprehend just how people might interpret these changes and use Bitcoin, and it could lead to vulnerabilities from a code security perspective. Now, that is one way. The other way that I could potentially see Bitcoin failing is, and it may fail in the short term, but may recover in the long term, but it would take a lot of years, is if more and more people are using traditional financial products like ETFs to go and purchase Bitcoin, like they go and buy Bitcoin through IBIT, BlackRock's IBIT. What we'll see is a whole bunch of capital flooding towards these ETFs, the majority of Bitcoin being held in these ETFs. And then if BlackRock wanted to, say, fork the code and create a BlackRock Bitcoin that offers some form of benefit to these various elites, what they can give the perception of is, in the market, if the people don't agree with a change in Bitcoin's code and we were to have a hard fork, they can choose to sell the coin or the token that is not serving them and hold on to the one that does. We've seen this through various hard forks over time, whether it's Bitcoin Cash, BSV and such, BCH, I think that's just Bitcoin Cash. We've seen this time and time again where people have chosen Bitcoin as opposed to these other hard fork tokens. But I think that if BlackRock own a large portion of Bitcoin, what they can do is they can sell off Bitcoin, maintaining BlackRock Bitcoin, and it gives the perception that the public has chosen. They've chosen BlackRock Bitcoin, when in reality, it's a facade.
Yeah. Well, Bitcoin is hope. And part of the reason I think we're both here is because we want to kind of help spread that hope to others through education. So yeah, thank you so much for your insights. I will drop your, the link to your book in the show notes, as well as your X account and anything else that you want. But do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the listeners?
I would honestly, I would just say I really enjoyed this conversation. And what the listeners probably haven't heard is that we've actually paused a bunch of times and had amazing conversation midway through the podcast, and which was a ton of fun as well, which I really enjoyed. I haven't done that before on a podcast. And no, I'm all for education, and I really appreciate what you're doing and just sharing different Bitcoiners' voices. I think if people want to learn more about these topics, obviously I've got Beers for Bitcoin, I've got The Hidden Cost of Money. Both those books are available on Amazon and such, but I never want price to be a barrier to entry. So if someone can't afford one of the books, feel free to just reach out, and I'm always just send over a copy of the ebook. But again, I really appreciate you having me on, Anja. And yeah, if anyone wants to find me, they can find me at sebbunny.com or Seb Bunney on Twitter.
Excellent. Thanks so much again for your time.
Still here? You're one of the good ones. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. If you enjoy how we cut through the noise, consider supporting us directly via the Lightning QR code. Got a question or a thought to share? Comments are wide open. We'd love to hear from you. For bonus content and updates, follow us on socials at Honest Money Show. Until next week, take care of yourself and your money and stay decentralized.